Welcome to She's Got This, the podcast for ambitious women who want to grow and scale their business and use the power of intentional energy direction to design their very best life. I'm your host, Christine Gallagher, award-winning business coach and mindset mentor to female entrepreneurs. If you're ready to own your brilliance while making bank, step into the absolute best version of you, and become a force for positive change in the world, you're in the right place. Let's do it. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here. If you're a regular listener, welcome back. If you're new, so glad you're here. You're listening to She's Got This, and I'm Christine Gallagher. Today, we're talking about what if you just tried this, which sounds a little cryptic, but we're going to jump into this. So you may have heard me talk on other episodes about how we are in the middle of a really big shift in human consciousness. This is what I believe. This is what a lot of other people out there in the spiritual world and circles believe as well, that we're entering sort of this new age where people are waking up to many things, one of them being that there is more than meets the eye to this world. And one of the things that is so exciting for me is that we are waking up, many of us are waking up to this idea that we are, as Neville Goddard would put it, the operant power. We have the power to create what it is that we want, that outside circumstances, that the quote 3D world doesn't have as much power as we maybe in the past have given it credit for having, and that it really is in our hands to create what it is that we want. So that's part of this sort of expanded consciousness that's going on. And so in the spirit of that, I wanted to talk today about some of the things that you can do to start really harnessing this for yourself. And much of this has to do with the law of assumption, which, again, I've talked about this in other episodes, but really, in a nutshell, what it's about is what you assume is true is actually what becomes true in your world. So if things right now in your life, in your business, in your relationships, in your health, in your income, in anything else, doesn't look the way you want it to look, there are things that you can actively do. And the thing that's really cool to me is that it's not necessarily about doing, although we just said do, right? It is something to do with action and taking action, but not in the traditional sense where you think about striving and hustling and grinding, right? It's more so that you are empowering yourself to look at what you can do inside, right? The inner game or the inner world that you have going on, and take that and really harness that for your good. And so it's less about, I have to work myself to the bone, and more about how can I take what I already have inside and really tap into that and use that power that we all have. So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of what if you just tried this, right? Try this on for size. What if you really took to heart this idea that creation is finished? So in the very first episode of this podcast that I did last year, one of the things that I talked about was one of my favorite quotes. And the quote is, "No desire is felt until the supply is ready to appear," which I always thought was a really magical concept. And that concept kind of has followed me and also comforted me throughout the years. And it's very similar to this idea that creation is finished, which basically means that everything already exists. Everything already exists, creation is done, and therefore what we want couldn't be a desire unless it already existed, because how could it be if we are thinking of it and wanting it and desiring it? It must already be possible. So what if you just tried this? What if you just tried to remind yourself on a regular basis that the thing that you want wouldn't be a want unless you could already have it? Now, from a more metaphysical perspective, what this really means is that if what you desire already exists, and you wouldn't desire it if it wasn't already possible for you, what that means is that there are versions of reality, infinite versions of reality. And in one of those versions is what you want. It already exists. And what we need to do is line up with that. So this is a concept that has to do with what you might have heard called the multiverse, or infinite realities, or parallel realities. all of the versions of the different realities already exist out there, and we can align with the one that we want. And we're going to talk more about what that means throughout this podcast episode, but that's how it relates to this idea that what you want is already here. Now, what I really love about this is that if you were to study any sort of spiritual teacher or manifestation guru or spiritual teacher, you will see that they are all coming to that same conclusion, that it's already done, that what you want already exists. They just may be saying it in different ways or applying varying techniques. But to me, that's really comforting, and it's really reassuring that they're all coming to that same point, just maybe from a different angle. So what if you just started to believe that you could have what you want? What if you just started to believe that it will work out for you, that it can happen fast, that it can happen easily, that it doesn't have to be hard? What if you believe that you deserve it, and that you believe that it's just normal for you to do and be whatever it is you desire? Now, what if you also decided to believe that there's no one to change but yourself? So when we say 3D doesn't matter, circumstances don't matter, what's going on outside of you doesn't matter, what we're really coming back to is that the concept of you, the concept you have of yourself, your self-concept, is the cause of all of the circumstances in your life. And so if you want to see change occur, it needs to come from within first, right? You've probably heard the saying, as within, so without. That's what that means. And so if you don't see things changing on the outside in your life, then usually what that means is you have not changed within. So what if you tried this? What if you started to remind yourself that it all starts within? And it's so easy, of course, to look outside of ourselves and say, this was the cause and this person did this and all of this. But the real truth is your consciousness is the only reality. And people and circumstances change outside of you when you change yourself first. And so when you see other people and how they're behaving and what they're doing, what that's really showing you is what you have conceived yourself to be. And so this is how you start changing your world, right? Because when you transform yourself, things outside of you, your world, start to rearrange to reflect what your change has affirmed. So this is about really falling in love, actually, with what you want to be, so much so that you actually become it. And again, Neville Goddard talks about everyone as you pushed out. He teaches or taught that nothing exists outside of your own consciousness, and the entire experience that you have of the world is just a projection of your internal consciousness. So what that's saying is your reality is nothing more than what you're actually imagining in your mind pushed out, and that everything around you is responding to what you are imagining, and it's mirroring your assumptions. So again, you are the operant power, and you get to create anything that you want. And so when you are changing your self-concept, which then changes your state, you can then start to watch the things that you're desiring come to you. So I mentioned the law of assumption, which is something I've talked about in several episodes of the podcast. And that really is a concept that involves creating what you want by believing that you already have it. And I also did an episode around this where I basically was saying, well, does this mean you walk around faking it, right? Does this mean you walk around sort of delusional about what you are, even though you're not really, quote, that yet in your 3D? And it doesn't mean faking it till you make it. It doesn't mean living in a fantasy. But what it does mean is that your work is done in the imagination, not in the 3D. Right? So you don't start creating new beliefs by acting as if and playing pretend, right? It's more about what you're doing inside of your mind, in your imagination. So I always like to break this down and make it more practical for people who are hearing these concepts, especially if you're hearing these concepts for the first time or it's new to you and you're still sort of practicing with it. What is the practical meaning of this in your everyday life? If we're not talking about going around delusional and faking it till you make it, what does it look like? So I'll give a simple example. Let's say you want a particular kind of business, level of income, or maybe it's a particular type of relationship, or maybe you're not married and you want to get married, or maybe it's a certain outcome in your health, or maybe it's a certain kind of social life or amount of friends or family that you have around you. Whatever it is that you want to improve or change in your life, what I would suggest is to go back in your imagination on a regular basis and imagine that that already exists in your life. So yes, you may imagine that and then open up your eyes and look around and go, well, it's not here yet. But it's about continuing to go back and persist in your imagination in seeing what you already want. And the other part of this that's really been helpful for me is just to remember to keep going back to that and to assure myself it's already done, it already exists. Because if I am imagining it and if I am seeing it and if I am feeling it, then it must already exist in some reality. So if I keep going back there and I keep reminding myself that this is already done for me, right? The 3D is just catching up in order to match up with what I want. It really gives me this sense of calm and this reassurance that, yes, even though I may look around right now and I don't see that outcome yet, what I'm actually seeing is just a shadow of my former beliefs. So if your former beliefs up to now have been that I can't have that relationship, I can never make that kind of money, I can't have that kind of business, I would never have that sort of robust social life, or my health is never going to get better, all of those types of things that are so easy to fall into as humans, right? Which is why this takes practice. You can see that stuff, but you can go back and remind yourself, you know what? Up until now, I was believing those things that weren't serving me, and I wasn't assuming that I already have what I want, right? So law of assumption, you're assuming that those things are already yours because you can see them and you can imagine them. And your imagination is the cause of everything in your life. It is consciousness. Consciousness is the only reality. How do we know this? Because everything that you see in your life, everything that you are encountering, whether that's a table, a chair, a house, a building, some sort of technology, that all originally came from somebody's imagination. So everything comes from our imagination originally and initially, and it's about persisting in going back to that and believing that it is already yours. The 3D just needs to catch up. Now, what if you just tried this? What if you decided to work on your self-concept just as much as you do anything outside of that? So, for example, you might be working on your business in terms of practical things, marketing and sales and networking and doing all the things that you have to do. And maybe some of that is getting you to where you want. And that's great, right? That's the active things that you're doing regularly to create results. But what if you use just as much energy, if not more, on your self-concept? And what we mean by self-concept, it's not just about self-love, right? It's about how you see yourself and understanding that no one else has to deem you worthy of what it is that you want. You are worthy of everything you desire because you exist. So to receive what you want, shift your identity and how you see yourself first. What if you actually put the time into cultivating that even more so than the practical actions? Because what happens is when you change your concept of yourself and how you see yourself, things become easier. And that self-concept starts to do more of the heavy lifting than doing all of these activities that might end up, as we said earlier, exhausting you and causing you to work yourself to the bone. I personally don't want to work that hard, which is why I was always so drawn to the idea of personal development and thinking about how can I actually tweak how I see myself, tweak what I'm saying to myself, how I'm picturing myself, what I deserve, what I'm worth, and doing the work around that and really using that to, as we said, do the heavy lifting. And when I talk about self-concept, I always like to also remind people that it's not just about the beliefs about yourself. It also applies to what you think about other people. So if you have this belief that is dominant, and that belief is that other people treat me like crap, well, then you're probably going to continue seeing that. You're probably going to continue experiencing that. And that's not to say, you should let anyone walk all over you or treat you badly. But when you choose to see other people differently, you will actually experience differently. So the thing to remember is that life responds to us based on our state of being. So what we're experiencing in our life is only showing us what we conceive ourselves to be, our self-concept. And the good news is that we're in total control of that. And there are lots of techniques out there that you can do to put yourself in the state of already having what you want. We're not going to get into that in this episode. I've done other episodes on that. But what you can do is do the things that give you that practice to go back to believing that you already have what you want, that things are lining up, right? So the new state of being that you want to be in, right? The new state of being where you have a self-concept that supports you in creating what you want, that version of you is the one that believes and expects and it knows and it trusts, right? And that's why it's important to pay attention to the state that you're actually embodying at any given moment. How are you showing up, right? Are you coming forward as this victim of circumstance, or are you coming forward as somebody who knows that they are the operant power and only you can decide that? And when you start to understand that the reality that you're experiencing is just a projection of your assumptions, what you're assuming about yourself and what you can be, do, have, or not, then you realize that you have the ultimate control. And that's how I choose to believe how life works for me. And so it does. And that's really an empowering place to come from. Okay, so what if you just tried this? What if you looked at what kind of inner conversations that you're having on a regular basis? And when we say inner conversations, that means mental conversations that we are carrying on with ourselves all day long, and we all do it. And what is important about inner conversations is they tell us which state we are thinking from. And inner conversations are really an easy way to think from your desire rather than think of your desire, which is important when we're talking about living in the end and already having what it is that you want, right? Acting as if it's done. And so for myself, again, I've talked about this in previous episodes, these are conversations that I really didn't monitor for a long time. And I don't think most of us do. I think as a human, it's really easy to be passive about the mental conversations that we're carrying on, whether we're, replaying an argument in our mind, or we're like anticipating an argument that's going to happen, or we're, thinking about how we're going to complain to our friend about what's going on in our life, that type of thing. So the very first step, as with anything, is having the awareness that you're doing it, right? So most of us, again, don't have that awareness that we're doing it, but I'm here to remind you of that. And it's something that I am always consistently reminding myself, and it gets easier over time and with more practice, but it starts there. Now, if we want to create our circumstances more consciously, that means that we need to shift our inner conversations to the wish fulfilled, meaning the outcome that you actually want. And so this is the first step in getting what you want. And you can think about it this way. Whenever what we're saying to ourselves inside and what it is that we actually want are conflicting, what we're saying to ourselves is what's going to win every time. So inner speech or inner conversations is what creates outer results. So it makes sense that if it matches with what we desire, then we get what we desire. But the good news is we have the power to change from the inside, as we've been talking about this in this episode. It's about persisting in the new inner conversation until you're at the point that you're convinced that it's actually reality. It starts to feel natural. And when you do that, you will see it in your actual physical experience because it has no choice but to show up. So if we make something natural to ourselves, we want to make something natural to ourselves, or in other words, make it an assumption, then we need to feel stable about that thing, right? So it's not about beating ourselves up. So if you notice you're having inner conversations and they are not in line with what you want, don't get mad at yourself, right? Don't call yourself bad or, beat yourself up about what you're thinking. You just want to be like, you know what? What am I thinking about right now? Like, what is actually going on in my mind right now? And this will start to slowly help you separate yourself from what you're thinking and the conversations you're having in your mind when you take a small step back. And this starts to make room for the thoughts that you'd rather have instead. So a very practical and simple example to illustrate this would be, instead of thinking about in your head how you're going to go see your best friend later and you're going to have a glass of wine with them, instead of sitting there and in advance fantasizing about how you're going to tell your friend about how your business is like not making money or not doing well, or these problems and that problems. You might instead imagine telling them excitedly how you're now making 5 figures or more a month or whatever the goal is, right? And you see and feel them congratulating you, and you and that person doing a happy dance. Now, does this mean you never have a vent session with your best friend or anything like that, where it may be you're focusing on things that you don't want just because you want to get it out and you want to feel better about expressing it to someone, or maybe even your therapist? No, of course not. You can do that. But again, this is about going back to where you consistently are, particularly in your imagination, right? So going back in your imagination, instead of spending the time that you're going to spend anyway, fantasizing about complaining and really getting into the nitty-gritty of what's not working, imagine yourself shifting that whole conversation so that it illustrates you actually getting what you want. And then something is happening in your imagination that shows that what you're wanting to have is actually reality. So in this example, it would be your friend congratulating you, because your friend would be congratulating you if you were talking to them about how great everything is going and how you're reaching your goals. So it's about going back to this in your imagination and being persistent. So what if you tried this with inner conversations, and remembering that inner conversations are so powerful that they really tend to evoke strong feelings within us. And sometimes we might even become so engrossed in them that we start to shut everything else out, which interestingly enough is exactly what you're supposed to do when it comes to manifestation, but we're often doing it by default, right? So usually it's that we unfortunately focus on scenarios that are negative, and we have our conversations from there. So this is about shifting that. And a good place to practice this from, if you're not sure where to start, is ask yourself, if I had the ideal self-concept, if I was who I truly wanted to be, like, what would I be saying? What would I be thinking? What would I be doing? What is it like to have that ideal self-concept? And what always helps me is to remind myself that when I want to get back to basics with the inner conversation idea, I remind myself that it's about making those inner conversations match the desires that I want to have fulfilled, right? So if you want to hear it on the outside, you have to hear it on the inside of yourself first. And if we're talking about our state, right, because it's our state that manifests, the conversations that we have inside are actually revealing to us the state that we are living in and persisting in, because our imagination actually mirrors our inner conversations. So if you want to change your state, which of course you want to do if you want to change what you're experiencing in your life, then you need to change your inner conversations. And by the way, just a quick tip on this, if you go to Google or you go on YouTube and you search for inner conversation meditation, there are actually meditations out there that you can find, and there's a lot of cool stuff that will help you with getting into this state as well. So here's something I really want to emphasize, especially going back to this idea of taking action and needing to know the how, and all of these things we hear when we are talking about topics like this. You know, you'll hear people who talk about how you don't need to know the how, and you don't need to lift a finger, and it's all in your imagination. And this can be really hard to wrap your brain around, especially if you're more of a strategic brain like I am. I'm like, what do you mean I don't need to know the action steps or the how, or I don't need to do the things, right? What it means to me, this is how I've sort of reconciled it in my brain, and it's why I really am sort of obsessed with all of this stuff, is because a lot of the stress and the upstream feeling that I've had in the past when it comes to thinking about my business and like what strategy to choose or what actions to take, a lot of that has dissolved with learning and practicing these concepts that we're talking about. Because what happens is you still end up taking action and doing practical things, but they're things that you're guided to once you're thinking in this different way, right? Once you're understanding that consciousness is the only reality, you're looking at your state, you're looking at your inner conversations, you're looking at your self-concept. The magic is you're really directing the energy, right? And that starts to guide you to do what you are supposed to do. And that to me is co-creation. That energy is what creates what you might think of as like incidents, or a bridge of incidents that leads you to what you desire. So it's not so much that action steps don't happen. It's that when you come from this place initially, when you build this foundation, the steps and the path are unveiled and revealed, and you follow that as you go. And the foundation is stronger and more supportive of you when you're doing these things, rather than being in the place where you're questioning whether you can do it, you're questioning whether you're worthy of it, you're feeling like it's impossible, you're remembering what your second grade teacher said, and that's influencing how you're looking at yourself, right? So it's coming from a much stronger platform. So to recap, the law of assumption is crucial to understand, in my belief, because most of us have been under this illusion that there are causes in our life other than our own state of consciousness. But everything that we do and everything that actually comes from us is a result of our consciousness. So that means what we believe, what we accept, what we desire, what we agree to. So before we change that outer world, our inner world needs to change. And again, how that happens is, first, as with any change, it needs to start with the awareness, and it needs to start with the desire, because most of us have desires to be something different or have something different or do something different, right? And so when you know that you want things to be different, then you can assume you already are that different person. And when you assume in that assumption until it feels natural and it's your dominant feeling, then your future, right, vision becomes a present fact. So there's a difference between knowing something because you see it on the outside, right, and actually becoming something. Being the thing is different than just talking about it or looking at it. So, for example, you need to be conscious of being wealthy if you want to know what wealth is. You need to be conscious of being love if you want to know what love is. You must be conscious of being successful if you want to know what success is. So when you assume that you already are what you want to be, and you live by faith in that assumption, you create a new version of yourself. And how do you do that? What is the instrument? It is your human imagination. And as Neville Goddard said, an assumption, though false, if persisted in, will harden into fact. And we actually live by the law of assumption every day in our lives. Yes, even you, if you have never heard of the law of assumption before, but we live by it unconsciously. And then our life gets created in a way where we're not being intentional about it, right? So we create our destiny in every moment, whether we're aware of that or not. But when we start to master it by really consciously controlling that imagination we've been talking about, we are setting ourselves free. So when you put your attention on what you desire, what you're doing is putting your attention on one state versus another and crowding out the other ideas, all of those other ideas that aren't serving you. So a single assumption leads to a bridge of incidents unfolding, which then leads to a result. So remember, the version of your life where you have everything you desire already exists. You may not see it right now because you can only see what's present in your consciousness. But when you begin to embody the state of already having what you want, then you can align with that version and allow it in. And as we said earlier, as soon as you change that, transform yourself, your world starts to rearrange and it reflects what your change affirms. And so what your assumption does is it calls back the view that you don't see and gives you that full picture and that full vision of it. So your assumptions are actually determining what portion of creation you experience. So why don't you just try this, try these concepts on for size and start to practice them and see how your life starts to change. And I promise you it will. So the keys are knowing your desire, using your imagination, and focusing your attention on the assumption that your wish has already been fulfilled. And when you understand this, and when you become aware of this, and when you make this a part of your everyday life, you start to become aware of one of the greatest powers that you will ever know. And I don't want you to just take my word for it. I want you to try it out, test it, and see. Okay, I love you guys. I hope this was super helpful for you and that you have a beautiful day. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love it if you could leave me a review on iTunes or share it with someone else who would find it helpful. To stay connected with me, please visit shesgotclients.com and sign up for my email list at the bottom of the page. Or feel free to share this episode on your Instagram and tag me at Christine G and I'll repost you. I would love to share this with as many people as possible. I love you. Until next time, keep shining your light.